It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Reno, Nevada, I am John Ramey. We have a widening war in the Middle East between Israel and its numerous foes. We have a jobs report that is very positive. We have a quick look at the Austrian election upcoming. Also, a strike on pause on the labor front. Let's start in the Middle East, Sam. There are actually quite a few very important events that we can talk about that have taken place this week. The latest from the New York Times: Israeli warplanes carried out airstrikes at midnight on Thursday on an underground bunker where senior Hezbollah leaders were believed to be meeting, including the presumed successor to Hezbollah's recently assassinated chief. This is according to 3 Israeli officials talking to the New York Times. This is also the Times. Israel is now carrying out major operations on multiple fronts. The explosions in Dahia, a stronghold of the militant group that's south of Beirut, came shortly after an Israeli warplane carried out an airstrike in Tulkarm. That is in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Now, Sam, as far as I can recall, an Israeli military plane carrying out a strike in the West Bank is unprecedented.
I believe that's right. If it's not unprecedented, it's certainly extraordinarily rare. Let's put it that way.
Palestinian health officials said at least 18 people were killed. This has to be contextualized, Sam, with what took place earlier in the week. This is CNN's reporting. Iran's huge barrage of ballistic missiles fired at Israel Tuesday night, capping a day of dramatic military escalation in the region. Iran launched a salvo of about 200 ballistic missiles at Israeli military targets, its largest ever such attack. This is CNN. Sending sirens blaring across Israel and activating the country's sophisticated defensive systems. Now, I've looked over various published reports on this attack. No casualties and minimal damage?
That's correct, yes. Actually, one person was killed, and that was a Palestinian in the West Bank who was killed by falling debris. So in their attempt to strike back at Israel, Iran ended up killing one Arab. And so it seems as though this attack was not any more effective than their attack in April, which, as you say, is being characterized as a smaller attack than this week's attack, even though it involved more
projectiles.
That's right. Yeah. But the reason it's being described that way, and it is an accurate description, is because this week's attack involved much larger and more sophisticated munitions. So there were 180 ballistic missiles, which are, again, have much more firepower.
And are harder to shoot down.
That's right. And then the cruise missiles and drones, which I believe numbered about 300 back in April. The reason they're harder to shoot down is because they're much faster.
Right. And also, I read in some of the reporting that in the April attack, Israel was given 72 hours notice.
That's right.
So people could evacuate and prepare, shelter. There was only like there was hours, not days of notice before this Iranian attack.
And I mean, the attack in April almost seemed, even at the time, sort of like a pantomime attack. In other words, Iran gave everybody notice that it was going to happen, seemingly designing the attack so that it could be thwarted and just be seen as a gesture. This attack was very different in that respect. It was a real attack with much more sophisticated munitions. And of course, one of the main events that precipitated this whole wave of reciprocal attacks by Israel and Iran was the assassination last week of Hassan Nasrallah, the 30-year leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this was a dramatic gesture on the part of Israel. And it followed, of course, the attacks we discussed of the pagers and walkie-talkies of Hezbollah being sabotaged by Israel in a very sophisticated supply chain sabotage operation, which seemed at the time as though it might, in fact, be a prelude to a dramatic escalation of the conflict in the region on the part of Israel. And let's be frank about this. This is Israel escalating the conflict. They have legitimate reasons, I would say, for doing so, or what they can present as legitimate reasons. But that is what's going on here.
Sure. But if somebody on the Canadian side of the border with Detroit or Michigan were lobbing small numbers of missiles for years, at some point the United States might escalate it, and it might be justified, at least from the United States.
That's exactly what I mean. It's not as if this just comes out of nowhere, right? But the point is that the United States has said, and of course we're coming up upon the 1-year anniversary of the terrorist atrocity attacks by Hamas against Israel, which touched off this whole conflict to begin with. The United States has said ever since those attacks that it would not be in anyone's interest for this conflict to escalate in a regional war. Israel seems to have decided that it is in their interest to do so. And I'm not saying they're wrong about that. But the point is that this puts them at odds with the expressed policy position of their primary ally and patron, the United States of America. And so the United States is implicated in this particular escalation. I think that there are so many aspects of this that we could talk about at length, but the main thrust of this is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has basically come out and said that he means to redraw the strategic calculus across the entire region. He addressed the United Nations General Assembly about a week ago.
We'll throw the picture up here.
That's right, in which he, and I have to say, as much as I hold Prime Minister Netanyahu in a great deal of disdain, he has this habit of employing charts and graphs and maps and stuff like this, and I just find that very entertaining. I don't know why. But if you look at the two different maps he was holding, one of them is the curse and the other one is the blessing, right? He explicitly drew two different scenarios for the strategic future of the Middle East. And one thing I found odd about this, and this is just sort of an aside, but if you look at the blessing map in which the nations are colored in green, one of those green colored nations is Sudan. And I'm sort of like, hey, buddy, get over yourself. I mean, do you really think that whatever happens as a result of your war, your proxy war against Iran, is going to somehow solve the conflict in Sudan? Because guess what? It won't. And it's ridiculous for you to actually imply that it will. And so as much as it's entertaining to watch him, hold up these pictures and things like this, at a certain point, it just sort of feels ridiculous. However, as a seasoned politician, Netanyahu, like any politician, often says things that are not true and or ridiculous. But when he talks about his broad intentions strategically in the region, I think we have to take him at his word. I think he means it. I think he really does intend to redraw the strategic landscape of the region. And he might feel, and I think, by the way, his voters also feel that he has very legitimate reasons for wanting to do so. It just makes me uneasy, and I think a lot of other people as well, because ambitions of redrawing the strategic calculus in the Middle East often work out very badly for everybody concerned, including the people trying to do the redrawing.
I completely understand. History has taught us that lesson many times, has taught the United States that lesson. I want to play a little devil's advocate here.
Okay.
There was a recent report. It was a bit of a clarification. There was a question in the vice presidential debate, I think, about Iranian nuclear capability and their timeline. And after the vice presidential debate, there was a published report. I'm forgetting where it was, but it basically said the question posed during the vice presidential debate had said Iran was on a much nearer term timeline to being nuclear armed, and the question had conflated nuclear fuel versus machining it into a weapon. And so the kind of follow up of the clarification had said it's about a year for Iran, right? They're about a year away from nuclear capability. Setting aside the carnage and the human suffering, why wouldn't the United States and its allies want Israel now that a war is apparently here and escalating, right? Now that diplomacy is failing, what's the downside, again, strategically, not from a perspective of human suffering, of just letting Israel completely degrade Iran's nuclear capability and military capability generally?
Okay, first of all,
because I don't want a country that chants death to America in their parliament all the time having nuclear weapons. And I think that's a reasonable position.
Okay, I get that. And the answer is we don't know. And if we don't know, then we can't actually tabulate the risks.
So it's a can of worm. It's a can of worms situation.
Yes.
It's unknown unknowns.
Or it's a can of something, right? At best, it might be worms in there, but there's no label on the can.
Okay. And just like the Iraq invasion.
Yes. And the other thing I would say about this, though, is that sure, you might be able to wipe out Iran's nuclear capabilities. You might not be able to. And
really, you don't think Israel with their technology and I'm saying, and let's say America, the United States endorses it, which
they will not do. I mean,
the Biden administration has said, do not attack Iranian nuclear facilities.
That's right.
Or they won't allow. Yeah.
So some of these facilities are deep underground. Right? That you might be able to destroy all of them, but you might not be able to. That's all I'm saying. Right.
Well, I'm saying if the United States somehow hypothetically endorsed that strategy, maybe I'm naive, and I'm saying that
you are naive. The United States has said that they will not endorse it. I suppose if Donald Trump wins the election, he might, but that's sort of academic, right? You might not be able to fully destroy them, and then
that's right.
If you can't, they'll go for a nuclear weapon as quickly as they possibly can. And I might add, you can put all the sanctions that you want on them. Okay. If North Korea, one of the most desperately poor countries on earth, can have nuclear weapons, which they do, anybody can. It's just a question of making the political decision to do it. This idea that we can decide who does or does not have nuclear weapons, it's ridiculous. It's stupid. Okay. And so anybody who's floating this idea out there, they need to put on their big boy pants and look at the world as it actually is, because this is a folly.
So Iran's lack of nuclear capability currently has nothing to do with U.S. policy or Western policy or sanctions or anything. It's just a political decision within Iran.
Absolutely. They could have done it by now if they really wanted to. And
why wouldn't they have?
They might wish they had.
Yeah.
All right. The reason I would guess anyway, I don't know. I've never actually spoken to anybody inside of the Iranian regime, despite my best efforts. But I would guess that the reason they haven't done it so far is because they've been very explicitly using it as a bargaining chip to get economic sanctions lifted, which is an enormous problem for their country. And if they could actually deliver an end to sanctions, that will be an enormous win for them. And of course, the Iranian regime is very large. That is, the state has many different factions within it. So you need to be able to keep everybody happy, especially since the amount of actual popular support you have amongst your people is very small, right? If you can't keep everybody happy inside the government, you could be in trouble. And so there are some people who would prefer to negotiate. For instance, the new president, who's said this over and over again, is that he's willing to come to the table to, renegotiate the agreement that Iran used to have with the international community about its nuclear weapons program. They explicitly do use it as a bargaining chip. If they go for the bomb, they can't do that.
Right.
And sanctions will never end.
Right. And then the dog that caught the car. Okay. Again, I don't mean to be, well, I don't mean to be naive or overly strategic about this because, of course, wars are terrible and it's already terrible. And uh, I'm trying to see how I'm trying to game out the least bad scenario right now because Israel killing a bunch of people on multiple fronts, justified or not, is terrible.
Yes. I mean, I would say, honestly, I think the least bad scenario is a ceasefire, but I don't think that's going to happen. That would be naive of me to say that
Right.
I think that's in the offing.
I mean, Netanyahu's never going to do that.
No, I don't think he will. And by the way, his increased involvement against Lebanon is much more widely supported by the by the Israeli public than the operations in Gaza, just because Hezbollah has always been a much more formidable military threat to Israel than Hamas. And so escalation for Netanyahu is actually a political win in addition to a strategic goal. And I think this is something that it would behoove us to keep in mind. And I would think also that it might not be as bad an idea militarily as some of us would think it would be, because everyone talks about how Israeli involvement in Lebanon has always gone poorly, and that is true.
We've talked about it here.
We have talked about it here. But the last time that happened was 2006, for about a month. And of course, before that, there was the 18-year occupation of southern Lebanon from 1982 to 2000, in which the Israeli military was essentially chased out of Lebanon after 18 years, basically by Hezbollah, who I would add basically didn't exist when that Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon began. Now, I don't want to say that the Israelis went into Lebanon in 1982 and all of a sudden everybody said, hey, let's form Hezbollah. All right. I mean, right. Hezbollah was obviously the result of a number of political pressures that had been building inside of Lebanon prior to the Israeli incursion. But the Israeli incursion certainly didn't help, right?
Is it a little bit like ISIS forming after the United States went into Iraq?
Very much. Yeah, I would say it's very much like that. Right. But I think that the last year has shown us that Israel's military and technological capabilities are much more advanced than those of its adversaries. The adversaries. This whole episode with the pagers and the walkie-talkies, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the former leader and the now late leader of Hamas, in Tehran, in the compound of the elite Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And one thing that we always hear about in reference to Israel is their tech sector, right? Which, much like our own aerospace sector here in the United States, sort of grew up hand in hand with the defense establishment in our country. And so their tech sector has come up in very much the same way. All the company founders, they're all veterans, right? Just like just about everybody in Israel is, right? But they have sort of brought their military background into their technological entrepreneurship. And so I think that the Israelis might believe that they have certain advantages now that they didn't have even in 2006, certainly that they didn't have in 2000 when they left Lebanon. And I think there might be something to that. And so let's just, cut to the chase here. They mean to put Hezbollah out of business, and to the same extent that they put Hamas out of business in Gaza. And so,
Right.
speaking before the United Nations General Assembly last week, Netanyahu essentially used the exact same language about Hezbollah in Lebanon as he's used about Hamas in Gaza, right? He says, our conflict is not with the Lebanese people, it's with Hezbollah, who, to be fair, basically do hold their entire country hostage. It's not the policy of Lebanon to lob rockets into Israel. It's just Hezbollah. And there are plenty of people in Lebanon who are saying right now, why do we have to let Hezbollah drag our whole country into this? And so Netanyahu is saying the same things about Lebanon as he's saying about the Palestinians in Gaza. They're using your population as human shields. But as we've discussed, Netanyahu's attitude seems to be it's perfectly acceptable to kill all the shields or to kill quite a lot of them. And not everybody agrees with him about that.
I mean, I do think if you're like some middle-class person in Beirut with a regular job, and maybe you don't wake up every day thinking death to Israel, and suddenly you're getting bombarded in a larger attack. Where did I read this? Oh, CNN reporting. Israel's bombardment of Lebanon is heavier than the height of the United States fight against ISIS, according to a conflict monitoring group. Most of America's 20-year war in Afghanistan, the U.S. carried out 3,000 airstrikes a year, except for the first year. Israel has already carried out 3,000 strikes against Lebanon.
Yeah,
it's insane
country.
Yeah.
And so
I'm saying if you're just a regular, what are you, a banker in Beirut? You've got to be thinking, I mean, first of all, your understanding or your empathy with the Israelis probably goes away pretty quickly. But if you're smart enough to understand the circumstances, yeah, you're wondering, why do we have to have Hezbollah dragging us into a war with a country that ostensibly there's no diplomatic, conflict with?
Yes, but the problem is that Hezbollah, as we've discussed, is deeply integrated inside of Lebanese society and has been for decades. That person in Beirut that you're talking about doesn't know a nation of Lebanon without Hezbollah, right? And so that you might be asking more of that person than they're capable of doing. Some of them certainly do think exactly what you're saying. But the problem is, or a problem is, that Lebanon has been a failing, if not failed, state for a very long time. And Hezbollah is one of the reasons for that failure, because they're able to block any progress towards being a successful state that Lebanon might be able to make. And it's a question of what can be done about this for Lebanese people if Hezbollah is allowed to remain in place. But is the only solution to that problem having Israel wipe them out? I mean, that just seems like a very costly solution. And there are people inside the actual Lebanese government who will say that we're willing to police the border, right? If Hezbollah can be dislodged from southern Lebanon, the Lebanese military is willing to do it if we get international help. That would be an enormous step forward if it could be done.
Okay. I'm glad you bring this up. The one character or the one actor that I haven't read too much about is the Lebanese government.
Well, it's because they're extraordinarily weak, right?
But there has to be some, I understand that, but there has to be some diplomatic entity that maybe through a third party could at least coordinate with the Israelis. If they both don't like Hezbollah, then they have a common enemy.
Yes, but again, the Lebanese state is very, very weak. It's very difficult for them to do much of anything.
So there are people difficult for them to muster the political power to even get cooperation. Okay,
and so I think it's possible that some kind of temporary solution can be brought to bear. But of course, the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 was brought to an end through a United Nations resolution 1701, which was never honored, mainly dishonored by Hezbollah, who were supposed to withdraw from southern Lebanon up to past the Litani River, and they never did. Now, I'm sure that Israel itself has violated Resolution 1701 in any number of ways. But the point is that Hezbollah has never honored this, right? And it would be better for the people of Lebanon had they done so.
Jobs report?
Sure.
Jobs report. Okay. NBC reporting today, the United States added 254,000 jobs in September, more than 250,000, far exceeding expectations, while the unemployment rate fell from 4.2 to 4.1. Forecasts were for just 150,000 new jobs. Data from previous months also revised upward. August got 17,000 more jobs, and July got 55,000 more jobs. Quote, a soft landing is in sight. Elise Ausenbaugh, head of investment strategy at JP Morgan Wealth Management, told ABC News in a statement. Quote, the bottom line here is that a resilient labor market is continuing to support consumers and the Fed is cutting rates. End of quotation. I mean, I have to say the Fed rate cut is only, 2 weeks before this jobs report. So possibly more flowery news for the U.S. economy coming in October.
I guess. I mean, honestly, that's too fast, right? I mean, it sort of feels like the Fed cut rates and, hey, look, there's a whole bunch of jobs, right? That's not actually how this works, right?
Right. We're turning around a battleship. It doesn't happen that
That's
fast.
Right. And so it would seem that, for instance, investors initially reacted very positively to this. And I think markets at this time are still on the positive side, but they fell back a little bit. And I think you could understand
they're up today, Sam.
Well, I know they're up today, but but they didn't explode basically with positive energy is what I'm saying, right? And I think the reason for that is that this might actually moderate the pace at which the Federal Reserve cuts rates in the future. You'll recall that they started with a half-point rate cut instead of a quarter-point rate cut. And so they've got room to stand pat if they want to. And this is a pretty hot report, right? And so if they think that inflationary pressures are going to continue to build, they might not cut rates as quickly as people thought they might, right? And of course, investors love it when the Fed cuts rates. And so we'll have to see how this plays out in future meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee. But of course, I'm sure that all of our listeners find this topic just as fascinating as we do.
It's important, Sam. People out there have portfolios. People out there buy and sell real estate. To be honest with you, before I became somebody who owned real estate, which was until 3 years ago, like all of my adulthood, I thought, the Fed, the markets, and anything that impacted it was totally boring. And now I realize, this affects millions of Americans in a very kind of bottom line way.
That's
Even
right.
though it's like egg brain stuff, but it's also Main Street stuff in a strange way.
Yes, it is. And for example, the Federal
or
Reserve,
perhaps with the Fed, it's Shakedown Street.
Oh,
Sorry, that's for the deadheads out there.
Yes. It's interesting because the Federal Reserve might have had to deal with much more serious inflationary pressures had the dock workers strike not been suspended last night. Right?
Sam, that is a very adroit segue into another story.
Yeah, thank you. I thought so myself. But if the dock workers strike had not been suspended, then goods would have been piling up outside ports just like they were a few years ago.
Hey, the markets went in the toilet for a couple of days.
My God. Yeah, it was kind of frightening, frankly. But the strike has been suspended till January 15th.
This is the International Longshoremen? Is this?
That's right. The International Longshoremen's Association against the United States Maritime Association, who represents ports and shippers. And it seems as though they've come to terms on the pay increase, which is lavish, by the way. And they're still working on the language about automation and I think pensions. Now, it's possible that this will all fall apart and the strike will resume in January. But And to be fair, whatever inflationary pressures would have resulted from the strike, the Federal Reserve would have been entirely justified in classifying those pressures as transitory. Right? Because right. the strike will end, right? And, then so there will be some damage to the economy, but it's not a sort of deep structural problem inside of the economy that'll take years to sort out, right? And justify, huge interest rate increases, I think is
right. A strike on the East Coast is not a global pandemic and a supply chain reshuffle.
That's right. It's not on that order. It's very serious, right? But it will come to an end. And I think a lot of people thought it would have a big political impact also. And so it seems like that's off the table, what I'm happy to say.
All right. We will get to Austria, but I do want to ask one question about politics. The American attitudes about the economy are still not particularly positive. Does another strong jobs report, the avoidance of this or this postponement of the strike, will there be any kind of wind in the sails for the incumbent administration?
I think maybe
and
a little
Harris,
bit.
who's essentially running as an incumbent.
Let's just put it this way: it won't be like an anchor dropping through the right. hull of the ship, right? If the port strike had gone on,
the strike could have totally torpedoed.
Could have been very bad. Although I would hope that somebody in the Harris campaign would have been smart enough to have her say, "Look, if you don't like the impact of the strike, then you should consider it just a preview of Donald Trump's sweeping tariff policy because it works exactly the same way. It'll raise the cost of every imported item that you buy every day. And the difference is, like we were just saying, a strike will end when reasonable people come to a compromise solution. Donald Trump's tariff policies will end when one ignoramus can figure out that he's wrong about something that he's believed for decades. Which would you prefer? And I think that they would have eventually rolled that out. But thankfully, we'll never know.
Austrian elections?
Yes.
I won't steal your line.
They took place on Sunday.
But what are they, Sam? They're Mad Libs.
It's basically, it's Mad Libs, right? All European elections these days seem like Mad Libs, right? It's in the European nation of blank, the far-right blank party edged out the traditional center-right blank party to win the election. Unfortunately for them, mainstream parties will refuse to work with them, so they probably won't be able to form a government. And in this case, the European nation is Austria, the far-right party is the Freedom Party, and the traditional center-right party is the People's Party. So you could basically just fill these in, and maybe there'll be another election in Europe sometime this year that'll be exactly the same. We'll be able to use the same Mad Libs for that one also.
Credit big stones on the center-right party for calling themselves the People's Party.
Well, actually, that's pretty common in Europe. Right.
Interesting. I think People's Park in Berkeley, right?
The center-right party in Spain is also called the People's Party, and the center-right grouping in the European Parliament is the European People's Party. This is actually pretty common amongst the traditional center-right in Europe.
The more you know.
Yeah.
That'll do it for us. That'll do it for us on Working for Crusoe. He's Sam. I'm John. We'll be back next Friday. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.